Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're joining this edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. My name is Dan Johnson. I'm going to be your bandit for the day. And joining me is my very special guest, Ben Dunn. For folks who do not know, Ben Dunn is one of the co founders of Antarctic Press. And for the last 40 years, Antarctic Press has been one of the leading voices in independent comic books. Today, Ben is going to be joining me, and we're going to talk about his career, but we're also going to be talking about the state of indie comics and the impact that it has on the market today. It's a very lively discussion. It was such a lively one, we had to do it in two parts. But like I said, stick with us. I think you're going to have a great time. And it is my pleasure today to be speaking with Anarch Press's Ben Dunn. Ben, thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Awesome. It's great. It's great to have you here. Um, Ben, first of all, for folks who may not know who you are, we have a standard question that we start with, and that is what got you into comic books?
Well, I'll be honest, I was a lifelong comic book reader. I started reading comics when I was very young, as soon as I could read. I was reading the newspaper comics when we were getting the newspapers. That was my favorite section of the newspaper. And then I started reading comics when I could get them. We didn't, our family was not very well off, so I didn't run down. I didn't have much of an allowance, but whenever I could, I would buy comics or just get comics, and from people who, threw them away. And then I just fell in had a uh, lifelong love of comics ever since then. And, I've made it my mission to want to make a living doing comics.
I was going to say, a lot of folks want to get into comic books. They want to become writers, they want to become artists. What was it that drove you to decide to actually found your own company, Anarch Press?
Well, I wanted to work for Marvel. That was my favorite comic book company at the time. And when I was about 11 or 12, and I actually was foolish enough. Well, I figured, if you don't act on something, then it's never going to happen. So I sent
Yeah.
in a submission around 1978 or so, and I actually got a rejection letter from Marvel. They were very nice about it, but they didn't discourage me from trying to keep on trying, and I would probably bug the ever-loving crap out of them sending so many submissions, but I kept trying and kept trying. And then I got to the point where, I decided that maybe I needed to improve my skill level before they would hire me to do something. So I hooked up with a local comic book company here in San Antonio around 1982, 83, and I did my very first comic with them, and I actually got paid for it. So that was my very first professional work. It was with a company called Galaxy Comics, located here in San Antonio, and their very first comic was Bloody Bones and Black Eyed Peas, and number one, and that was my very first work,
Awesome. And
and it encouraged me to keep going.
well, that's the key thing. I mean, you get into the business, and everything that gets published, every credit you get, it helps to keep you going, and it keeps you motivated to get something else out there. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah, it was way harder back then to get into comics because you didn't have the internet. You're talking about the early 80s.
Yeah.
Internet was not a thing yet. You know, the there was no digital social media at the time. So you had to do everything by mail, and that was always slow. Or you had to, go out to conventions and meet people and make connections. That was the only way to really advance your career,
Yeah.
or mail in your submission and hope that the company will actually look at it.
Well, the good thing about the internet nowadays is you can get a response back in like 5 minutes saying no, we're not interested, as opposed to having to wait like 3 or 4 weeks to get a response back from a company, and it can be, speaking as a creator, it can be agonizing at times.
Yes, it is, but it's really a game. The thing is that it really was a game changer when you could now, contact people almost immediately. Didn't have to, there wasn't any waiting, for the most part. And not only that, you had access to artists and creators from all over the world, not just in the United States anymore. Back then, it was mostly domestic. We hired artists that were who knew understand American comics because that was the only thing at the time. There was no real independent comic book market back then, and manga certainly was not known at all. And except for like in small groups or niche fan circles. So that was the only way to break into business was just to contact. But uh, now it's the opposite. Publishers go out looking for you, instead of you trying to get into publishing. They're looking for uh, they no longer curate creators to take over a book. The editorial system at the big Marvel and DC has changed. There's no longer any real input from the editors anymore. It's all company driven. They only go by what will sell, what people will buy, instead of trying to curate real independent ideas, and new ideas that people are willing to read.
Yeah. Well, I can understand Marvel and DC not wanting to take too many risks creatively, especially nowadays when you got so many creators out there that are a little hesitant to share their best ideas with DC and Marvel, especially the way they tend to think if you create it for us, we own it, it's ours. Um, but yeah, that's one of the things I love about independent comic books and the indie scene is that you get a lot more creativity out there than you will with a lot of DC and Marvel books. It's not to say DC and Marvel can't do some good stuff now and then. It's just the really exciting stuff is coming from the creators that are like they're passionate about it because they own it. It's their creation, and plus two, there's a little bit more freedom to it. I think there's a lot less restrictions on you as an independent creator.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you were a creator and you couldn't own your creation, would you give away your best ideas?
Oh no,
That's the thing is the as long as Marvel and DC have no desire to um, share the success of something with their creator, you're going to get material that isn't going to be the best. It's not going to be anything new, exciting, or different. It just seems to me that they're shooting themselves in the foot by doing that. But I can understand why they want to. They do compensate. At least I don't. I'm not sure if this is the case nowadays. But it used to be they paid very high rates in order to retain talent in the knowledge that they're going to own what you create.
yeah,
And but unfortunately, I don't think that works anymore. As far as I mean, I haven't worked for Marvel or DC in a long time, so and I only did one project for each of them. So I don't know what the editorial um position is or the corporate position is. My understanding is they still own everything you create, and that's fine. That is totally up to the creator to decide whether they want to work for them or not. Just know that when you do work for them, they're going to own everything. When and if they do, then you really have no reason to whine or moan or, complain that the creation you made is making them millions of dollars. I mean, you knew what you were getting into when you signed the contract. I mean, not that I don't have sympathy with these creators, but they knew what they were getting into. I mean, they should have known, and so they have really no right to complain, in my opinion.
yeah. Well, I've always thought of it this way that I always go back to the Siegel and Schuster argument. People always talk about how Siegel and Schuster got screwed over with Superman, but at the time they sold a creation for like 130 bucks, which was a lot of money back in 1938, and it was also a feature that had been rejected by different syndicates, it had been different publishers, and it was kind of a we need something to fill this new comic book called Action Comics, so we're going to pop it in there. And
I mean,
it was
that's an infamous story, of course,
yeah.
that they sold, but they didn't know Superman was going to be that big hit.
Oh no,
They probably thought, hey, $130 is probably the most money they'd ever seen in their whole life, up to that point. And you're talking about 1938 when, 10 cents back then, I mean, it's worth like what? I don't know what the conversion is, but I mean it's worth way more now than it was back back then. And and they didn't have to sell it. They could have just held on to it. They had that much faith in the character. They would have stuck with it, and or made a better deal for themselves. Say, yeah, we'll sell you the character, but we want a royalty in ex also, like a percentage of every book that you make for after that. That would have secured their financial future. If they realized what I mean, they should have known, and it really it really befuddles me that creators come back later and say, "Oh, if I'd only known that this was going to be a big hit, I would have done things differently." Well, yes. If we could predict the future, we buy lotto tickets.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, when you create a comic book character, you never stop to think, hey, this is going to be a radio show in 2 years, and this is going to be in the guys who do Popeye are going to make cartoons based on this, and this is going to be a TV show and a movie, and it's going to
The
be the
thing is,
temple for
read the
a
contract.
franchise. Yeah,
Read the contracts. Yeah, so many artists are so eager to want to work back then, at least, wanted to get steady work. And there was really Marvel and DC were the only games in town, and it was a common practice for all publishers to do that. So, I think the only exception was like the Will Eisner Studios, but that's neither here nor there. But um, that's the thing is that no one's putting a gun to any of these creators' heads. If they wanted to work, they either signed the contract or they self-published. And there were a lot of creators that did that. Whether or not they were successful, you know, uh, was here and there, but you had that option. Unfortunately, back in then, a lot of them controlled the newsstand market, which was the only way to get your comics into the hands of people. It wasn't until alternate forms of distribution came up that uh, creators were able to start the independent comic book scene. Yeah.
right. Well, again, too, back in the day, a lot of the guys that were working on comic books were hoping to break in the comic strips. That was considered to be the big medium, was owning having a
Yeah, well,
comic
you
strip.
think you think drawing comics was hard, breaking into a syndicate was almost impossible.
Yeah,
They were so, but I mean, people had done it. I mean, Charles Schultz is a good example of that. People didn't think he was going to go anywhere, but he turned out to make one of the most popular comic strips of all time. You
right.
know, you just got to have faith in your own work. That's the
Yeah.
important thing. You gotta
What's
have faith.
Well, that's the key thing. I mean, anytime you send anything out to the universe to be seen by a publisher or an editor, you've got to have faith enough to put it out there so someone else can see it to begin with. So,
Yeah, and the thing is, don't be discouraged by initial, initial slowness in the acceptance of your work. I mean, there's a lot of comics that started off, very slow that built up an audience because the creator kept at it.
yeah.
I mean, you got to take the slow with the fast. That's the thing. It all balances out in the end.
Oh yeah. Well, getting back to the founding of Antarctic Press and Mangazine, I was going to ask you, what were some of the influences that you had as artists from the manga scene? Who were some of the Japanese artists or Asian artists that you appreciated?
Well, when I first discovered manga was back in like 75, 76, mid 70s when I went to Taiwan. I didn't even know they existed.
Yeah,
I mean, I've seen anime, but at the time it wasn't called anime, it was just called Japanese animation. And of course I've seen Speed Racer, I've seen Astro Boy and all those other shows, but it didn't occur to me that they were comics based on those creations. I just thought they were, because I'm a kid, you don't know, you don't think about things like that.
right,
So when I went to Taiwan, I was exposed to manga for the first time, and it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mean, this is the mid 70s, so Taiwan received. They didn't have their own manga comic book industry, so all the comics that were in Taiwan were Japanese. So I was able to buy a lot of, and they were cheap. A standard, um, you know, comic book back then, which was a little thick paperback size, collections were about at the time equivalent to about 15 to 20 cents a piece. So you could buy literally huge stackfuls of them for very little money. So they were very popular with kids because they were cheap entertainment. It was way cheaper than, I mean, not cheap as watching TV, but
Yeah.
it was still cheap entertainment that anybody could get into. And I discovered, I didn't know who the artists were. I just knew I liked the subject matter. There were giant robot mangas, there were superhero mangas or science fiction mangas. There was manga about almost every conceivable subject you think of. There was mangas about fishing, there was mangas about photography, there was
Hmm.
mangas about sports. There was a lot of sports mangas. I mean, it was just everything, which was different than the comic books I was used to, which was all primarily 90% superheroes. Sure, there was some Western, some romance and stuff at the time, but almost like 90% of comics, well, of course, except for Archie, like well, maybe like 70 or 80% were superhero comics. And that's what I read. But this exposed me to that comics could do different things, and that's where I found out the works that I really admire were like Go Nagai, who did Mazinger Z, and all the other robot shows. And then I really love Ishimori, who did Kamen Rider and Cyborg 009 and a lot of other stuff as well. And there was a lot of other manga artists who I'm not familiar with, but that I really liked. I just basically bought everything that I liked, so I brought home a whole bunch of manga, and I thought, I love this manga thing because, it's black and white, which was unusual because I've always been exposed to just color comics. And I started imitating the style because it was a lot easier to imitate than trying to, copy the realistic style that American comics, was in. So I decided this is what I'd like to do. And I'd like to promote, this style of art, to Americans because I thought it was something new and unique and different. And that's when I started thinking about doing manga style stories because at the time, no American publisher, well, I think there was like one publisher did a manga adaptation of Barefoot Gen,
Yeah.
at the time, but there was no American publishers doing manga on a regular basis, or certainly not trying at all to bring manga to the United States. And I thought, this is something I want to do, and started uh, Antarctic Press to promote manga in the United States. And the very first publication we did was Mangazine, which is a play on the word magazine,
Yeah.
except with the word manga inserted into it.
Well, I was going to say, I was 16 years old in '86, and that's when I first even discovered that there were manga books out there, and it was through a book on the history of manga that was published. And I
Yes,
remember,
you're right. There was a book called Manga that came out like in the
right,
early 80s, late 70s that was promoting the art form of manga at the time, and I think that was the very first major publication that actually talked about manga. Yeah.
I remember picking it up because it had to do with comics, so I was fascinated by it. And I remember reading it, and at first I thought, wow, the style is so different. And it was, for someone who had only been reading DC and Marvel comic books and a few indie books, it was a little
Mhm.
strange. But the more I got into it, and the more I discovered about anime, the more I started realizing the vibe that was there. That was, like you said, manga just has a different vibe. It hits a little bit differently than American comic books do. But also, I've come to appreciate the fact that it isn't just all superheroes. There are different genres that you can. There's something literally for everybody out there.
Yes, that is true. I mean, not only they don't have the same stigma there that they do here, because there they have manga for every age group, every gender, and they cater to those particular uh, readers. They know what they want, and they make material for them to read. If you look at the old mangas, and I've been looking at some of the older ones just recently, the the art is actually very simplistic. They had to, at least for some of them, at least for the kids mangas and stuff, they had to put them out almost every week. So they had to make a lot of concessions on the art in order to maintain that kind of grueling schedule. And if you look at some of the earlier mangas, they do have a very simplistic art style, but it's still also very expressive, and they tend not to spend too much time overwriting, which is something that American comics, tend to do. They try to put too much dialogue or exposition instead of letting the picture tell the story. And in Japan, the manga lets the picture tell the story, and that's how they it that's one thing I noticed about manga that was way different than American comics. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I appreciate also is the fact that it's so much creator owned. Well, I hear
Well,
academia, for example.
not
It's,
all the time.
Mhm.
There's a lot of the Japan, the some of the manga were licensed, or owned by bigger companies. I mean, the thing about copyright in Japan is way different than copyright here. When a creator creates something, they're assumed to own the creation. Okay, it doesn't, but um, it's a complicated dichotomy between the big publishers there and the companies there and the creator. They all try to work in some sort of, and don't get me wrong, Japan, it's not all sunshines and rainbow in Japan as far as the manga, thing. Everyone it just assumes that, oh, all the creators there are doing so well. No, it's brutal.
Yeah,
Okay, in Japan. You think it's bad here, it's worse there. The thing is that if you make it, then you stand to create benefit from that because everybody, treats the your creation that assume that you own it and that you should benefit from it. But that's not to say there isn't some ruthless shenanigans going on in the Japanese, manga uh market. It's like I say, it's not all sunshine and rainbows there. A lot of comic manga artists don't last very long.
right.
They'll create something, it'll be hot, and then readers get tired of it, and then they're forgotten. And that's the brutal truth about working in manga in Japan is that a lot of mangas are overworked and underpaid.
Yeah,
They do it because they want it. You know, the they do it because that's what they want to do. But sooner or later, unless they can keep it up, there's very few manga artists who have stood the test of time, for more than 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them just go by the wayside and are just replaced by other, new hotter creators. Because the thing is that in Japan, readers are allowed to vote on their favorite manga stories.
right.
And if they like a particular story, they'll keep going. But if they don't, then they're usually taken out, and um, and ends up in obscurity, for the most part. Here we have a love for good comics, no matter how old they are. The trouble is that most of those creators probably never benefited from their creation, but I'm glad that things are changing with the independent market and Kickstarter and crowdfunding and digital comics.
Right.
Now anybody with a dream can put their stuff out there and see if the market will accept it.
Well, that's something I've been talking to a lot of creators about. There are a lot of folks I know that are talking about they want to get in with DC or they want to get in with Marvel. And I keep saying, if you got something you want to do yourself, then go out there and make it yourself. I mean, with
That's right.
Kickstarter,
I agree with you. I think if you do something really good that people like, they'll come to you.
yeah.
You don't need to go to them. They'll come to
Well, it
you.
isn't wasn't a case where you've got to look for somebody to publish your book. If you can, there are comic book publishers out there that you can find yourself. You can compare prices. Um, and with Kickstarters and such, I mean, you may not make a lot of money off of it, but you at least make enough money to cover the book and cover postage. And if that's, I think that's what a lot of folks are just really wanting is have their story told and have it be seen by people. And that, well, I said if you're getting into comic books for fame and fortune, there are easier things you can do to make money and become famous. But if you're doing it for a love of comic books, then now's the best time ever, I think.
I agree. One of the strange things, I don't know if this is true or not. Um, but I don't know if there's a Japanese or equivalent of Kickstarter.
Hmm.
Is there a crowdfunding site that Japanese creators can go to promote their material? I'm not aware if there is any,
I
you
know
know.
that I know they have like the annual conventions where creators will bring their own books. I
Yeah,
think a
they
lot
have
of
Comic Cat, but that's usually mostly for like fan circles trying to promote their manga, and that's only twice a year. Kickstarter and Indiegogo, they're year round. Okay,
right.
you can do it anytime you want, as long as they accept your campaign. And I'm not sure, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's a Japanese equivalent of Kickstarter, or any crowdfunding site that I'm aware of. If there is, I would like to know.
Well, I was going to say with Comic Head, I know they do their own stuff, but that's just it. I don't know if this is out of pocket or if they're finding ways to kick it. That's actually a very good question. I would like to find that out myself right now because
Yeah, because I know here we do translated manga and we do crowdfunders for those. We recently did Catch It one, by Motofumi, and we're doing some others, like oh my gosh, we just recently did the one, a horror manga. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but the thing is, we do manga crowdfunders here, but it just seems odd to me that there's no Japanese equivalent to Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I mean, if there is, I'm
yeah,
not aware.
I would love to find that out myself because if that's the case, I would love to see about promoting some projects in Japan because
Yeah, I would like to see what's being offered by independent Japanese creators,
yeah,
and maybe we can find some new talent that way. Because
exactly.
sometimes Kickstarter and Indiegogo is some of the best ways for us to find new material for us. A lot of creators who have funded their creations through crowdfunding end up, sending their projects to us to get into comic book stores.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I look at it as a win-win for those creators, because if their Kickstarter was successful, they've already paid for their project,
Right.
and once the project's complete, what else are you going to do with it? You
Yeah,
might as well
exactly.
bring it to us and we'll reprint it and put it into comic book stores where you can find a new audience. And if a new audience finds your stuff, the next time you do another Kickstarter, they'll say, "Oh, I remember, that thing at the comic book store, and I'll
Hmm.
support this, as well." So to me that's the new dynamic, and I notice a lot of publishers now are collecting some of their old material in omnibuses, to um, uh, or licensing, material that's never been made into a comic, like SWAT cats, things like that. Yes, as far as I know, wasn't there a comic of SWAT cats? I can't remember if there was one or not.
Can't remember.
I
I can't
swear
remember
that
if
I
there
thought I
was.
remembered there was one when it came out, but they recently did a crowdfunder which did very well, but my understanding is that they had never been adapted into comic book format.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. But of course, that's not creator owned. That's a licensed product,
Right.
But there are creators out there who are doing very well. Tim Lim is one of them who does Common America. I think um, Lady Death was there, but they did their own thing now. So now they're crowdfunding their own projects, which is a trend I'm seeing now. A lot of big time creators are now deciding that we don't have to deal with, Indiegogo or Kickstarter. We just do our own crowdfunding and then
Right.
keep 100% of the proceeds instead of giving, 10 or 15% to the crowdfunding sites. That can make a big difference. 10
Yeah.
or 15% can make a big difference. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say I just got to notice that we're down to the last 10 minutes for this
Oh, we've been
first
yapping
video.
that long. Oh my gosh.
Well, oh no, 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 that's no problem. Well, like I said, I've got a second meeting set up, but real fast, I did want to talk to you about. the initial reaction that you guys got to Mangazine. Like I said, when I was 16 years old, manga was different for me. It was something brand new and a little, like I said, well, foreign. Foreign is the best way to put it. But as I've gotten older, I learned to appreciate it. But I was wanting to ask what the initial reaction that you guys got that was positive from Mangazine.
Well, we didn't know what kind of reaction we were going to get. We did actually pretty good with Mangazine. The problem was that I was trying to keep up with the anthology format because you're dealing with several creators and not every creator is on the same page. So it ended up being a lot of them were late in getting their material in. I wasn't. I always put in my stuff on time.
Mhm.
But a lot of creators didn't send in their material, so it was hard to maintain a schedule. And the most important thing at the time was that you had to come out on a regular basis or somewhat. The thing that retailers at the time hated the most was not getting your product out on time and putting your product out on a regular basis.
Right.
And we were a small company, so we were playing it by ear. We were trying our best, so I knew pretty early that for us to survive as a company, we had to create our own material that we could control 100%, in order to maintain our output. And I knew that we had to create things that the company could own, that it could exploit on its own. So we made it our mission to create our own IPs, and of course I drew a lot from anime and manga, to see how well that would do. And originally we were going to do superhero titles, but I thought, what was the point of doing a superhero title when Marvel and DC were kicking ass on superhero titles? So it seemed like a losing proposition, because what kind of superheroes could we offer that Marvel and DC couldn't offer? So we decided to take more of a manga approach and start doing things that we knew we would have very little competition with. So we started doing giant robot stories. We started doing teen comedies, which was really starting to become popular in Japan. And that's where I got the idea with Ninja High School. Uh, and uh, uh, and I've been doing it ever since, except for the 5-year period when it wasn't coming out.
But I did want to talk to you about one of the first books I did read that was sort of an American manga, and that was Dynamo Joe. And I talked to Doug Rice about the series, and I was going to ask about how you got brought on board to do that comic book.
Well, I mean, at the time, a lot of companies were starting to get into the manga game, and I had a reputation of doing manga, believe it or not. And because I was putting out stuff on a regular basis, and that's really important. When you're putting out material on a regular, people see it. They know of it. So when Doug Rice fell behind on his schedule and they needed fill-in artists, they contacted me saying if I'd be willing to do a couple of fill-in issues. I said, yeah, of course I'll do it. Because I love Dynamo Joe. It's one of my favorite books at the time. And I dreamed of wanting to do it because I thought it was a really awesome, comic book series. So when they offered it to me, I jumped at the chance to do it. Phil Foglio was the writer at the time. He sent me layouts and I copied them, and I managed to do a couple of issues of Dynamo Joe. But unfortunately, I think it didn't last very long, and it was canceled a couple of issues after I took over.
Yeah. Well, I know Doug had mentioned, first comics and everything. It was again, it
Yeah.
was indie comics in the wild. It was the Wild West and indie comics back in the 1980s and everything.
Well, First Comics was actually doing pretty well, but they made a couple of business decisions I think were questionable, and unfortunately that led to their ultimate demise.
Folks, welcome back to Dollar Bin Bandits. If you're watching this on YouTube, no, you did not experience a time jump. This was such a big interview. It actually took us 2 years to get it done. We started this in 2025 and we're finishing it up in 2026. Uh, but I am still
Better
speaking with
late than never.
better late than never, yes. I am speaking with Ben Dunn, who is not only a talented creator, he's also one of the most patient men in comic books. Because if you had seen what we had just gone through to get part two to you folks, you'd understand he has the patience of a saint. Ben, thank you again very much.
Always well worth it. It's always well worth it to be with you, Dan.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that very
No
much.
problem.
Anyway, um, well last year we had a ball talking about your early career, how you got started in comics. Um, I thought for the last part of this interview we'd focus on probably the work that you're best known for, which is Ninja High School. I was wanting to ask about how that series got started.
Oh gosh. Well, it starts when was exposed to anime and manga. I was a big fan of anime and manga when I was a little kid, and of course, I didn't have a lot exposed at the time because there just wasn't that much in the United States. It wasn't until my trip to Taiwan where I was finally exposed to a huge plethora of anime and manga, in huge volumes. So when I returned back to the States, that was one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to do manga and promote it, as a, separate uh, comic book form, here, because that's what I wanted to share with everyone. And uh, that was one of the reasons why I started Antarctic Press, and that's why we did Mangazine. Now, when we did Mangazine, we were doing okay with it, but I realized at the time that we needed our own IPs. We needed our own series, something to anchor the company with, because you cannot survive on just an anthology alone. You have to create material for your company, especially if you're doing a new comic book company, uh, where people can readily identify your company with those characters. Now, originally, I was going to do a superhero series to do that. I was going to do a series called The Peacekeepers, which I created in high school, and I wanted to bring those into the comic book audience. But I was exposed to a new anime at the time uh, called Urusayatsu, and that was manga created by Yumiko Takahashi, and it was at the time during the early '80s, early '80s. There's this new genre coming out from Japan called the high school, comedy,
Right.
where basically um, take the settings of high school and just weird stuff happens. And I liked that premise a lot, and I was watching a lot of shows at the time. There was one particular show that I didn't know the title to, where there were ninjas in it, and I just called it Ninja High School. And that title stuck with me. And it said, you know what, I'm going to take that title. I'm going to do something different with it. I'm going to do something with it. So I took inspiration from Urusei Yatsura and all the other Japanese anime that were teen comedy centric, and took the basic trope of the love triangle that Archie is famous for, and
Right.
gave it my own manga spin. Sort of mashed them all together to trope Archie tropes and the manga tropes, and just mash them together into Ninja High School. And that's how it was born, and I've been doing it ever since. You
Yeah.
know, and I've just been happy doing it.
Well, I was going to say when I first started looking at the early chapters, there was sort of a nice Archie vibe to it. And again, Archie's been in business for over 80 years, so it's something that hits with people. I think it definitely does. Plus, it kind of reminds me of like the slice of life comedies that are big in Japan in the animation, which a lot of people are drawn to also. But again, it's a good mix, like you said, of the different genres, the ninja, science fiction, and it just seems like a nice collection of so many different things that just kind of come together. So,
Right. I mean, there was no question that the Archie. In fact, I was going to do a parody of Archie, but they shut that down very quickly. Because they didn't want me to do it. But anyway, I tried to uh, take that and deviate from that and create its own thing.
right,
And that's to I think to a lot of creators, it's one thing to make satire or parody of something, but you got to give it its own identity, and that's what I was trying to prove. With Ninja High School, that I could world build, and create new characters that would be separate and stand on their own.
exactly. Well, I was going to say one of the great things about the book is you just celebrated your 200th issue.
Mhm.
And again, in the world of indie comics, that itself is a huge accomplishment, I think,
Well, thank you very
because
much.
there's just so many creators that don't make it that far. So,
Well, I mean, I would have actually been around 250, but there was a 5 year gap where I wasn't putting out any new issues.
mhm.
It was only till recently that I just restarted the series and I had a lot of catching up to do. So, but I finally made it to 200. So, I'm very proud of that accomplishment.
Well, it's a huge thing because, like I said, I know there's so many indie careers they have things that hold them back or they lose interest in the book. So again, being able to make it to that 200 milestone is really amazing. And
Oh, well, thank
congratulations on
you.
that.
I mean, it's becoming more and more commonplace nowadays. I think a lot of indie comics now are reaching those big milestone issues. I mean, I know that Cerebus was probably the first independent comic book to reach issue 300,
Yeah.
and that sort of opened the door for other independent creators to reach that milestone as well. I mean, Gold Digger just did it recently with issue 300. I mean, I still got 100 issues left to go, so that's going to take me at least another 5 6 years
Yeah.
to accomplish that, but I'm hoping I'll get to issue 300 eventually. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking in terms of it's like maybe one out of 20 comics actually gets to make it to that point. So, just,
1 out of 20, wow. That's that. I would probably say 1 out of 1,000, to be honest.
yeah. I'm generous to a fault.
You're an optimist, that's for sure.
Well, well, some people say the glass is half full, some people say the glass is half empty. I'm saying, hey, that's free water. So,
Yeah, that's true.
but no, you did mention Dave Sims. I wanted to ask about that because you've got a team up coming up with him on your book. It's a crossover
Yes,
with Service.
we're doing a crossover with Cerebus. Uh, he's doing a lot of the drawing. I did my part of it, sent him the pages. Now he's doing his part of it. And if anyone knows Dave, he's a very meticulous artist. He takes his time, and I told him take as long as you need because it'll be worth the wait. Because I figured that just the honor of crossing over with Cerebus is just something I've always dreamed of, and now it's happening. And I love doing that. I love crossing over with other independent comics because the one good thing about Ninja High School is it's such a flexible series. You could pretty much put it in any genre, in any situation, and it'll work.
Yeah.
Because the Ninja High School setup is just so flexible, in terms of being able to just do whatever you want.
Well, I was going to ask, how did it come about that you got teamed up with Dave?
Well, I just asked him, and he said yes. I always,
Well,
I always believe that it never hurts to ask.
yeah.
You don't be afraid to ask because you just have to take the attitude. The worst they can say is no, and you just life moves on, But if you don't ask, you'll never know.
Well, somebody saying no is the worst thing they can say. Although in my case, I've had a couple of people say, "Look, I've issued a restraining order. You've been told by the courts not to come within 50 feet of me. Get away from me right now, or I'm calling the cops."
Well, I think
But that's
that's an
just me. That's just me.
that's probably an overreaction. I think most people are decent. I think most creators are willing, to speak and to entertain, their fans and readers or other creators and stuff like that. I honestly believe that they're, our industry is full of decent. I mean, of course, there's exceptions, but I think for the most part, if you treat people with respect, you treat people with kindness, you'll get that in return. And if they don't want to bother, then you just take no and say, okay, fine, thank you very much for your time, and you just move on.
Yeah.
Don't hold it against them because you never know. Maybe later on, a few years down the line, maybe when things change, they'll eventually come around and say, hey, yeah, let's do that little project that you came up with me the first time around. The
Right.
thing is that don't be, don't hold it against somebody if they say they don't want to do anything with you. Just let's just move on. Move
Oh
on, do
yeah.
something else.
Oh, I agree. I mean, well, the thing is, a lot of people tend to forget. I mean, comic book writers and artists, they're human beings first and foremost. And some days you get people on a bad day, some people you get them on a good day. So,
Yeah,
and like, and really, and all kidding aside, yes, the worst thing a person can say is no.
right.
And the thing about it is, I've found in the past that if you open up a dialogue with them, if you stay friendly with them, eventually it might come around to the point where they're like, "Oh, yeah, let's go back and revisit that idea you had. Maybe now is the time for us to
Sure.
do this thing."
I think the worst thing that anybody can do is that if they're rejected is to badmouth, somebody just off the cuff.
Yeah.
It's, sometimes the emotions can hinder things later on down the line. And if you overreact or, attack somebody that didn't, when things don't go your way, that can come back to haunt you later on, and
Oh,
that's,
definitely. Yeah.
you definitely should not say or do anything you're going to regret later.
I've always been a firm believer that I wouldn't want my worst day held against me by anybody
Absolutely.
else. And again, sometimes you never know what people are going through. Sometimes,
Absolutely.
uh, working with back issue, I've had a chance to talk to different creators and found out certain situations they were going through at the time, and it's amazing. Some people that were going through health issues, people who were going through personal problems, were still willing to sit down and do an interview. But other folks, they may have had a personal setback with a project or something, and it put them off to wanting to be open. But the thing is, different people react to different ways. And again, the only thing you really do is accept people with the same grace that you'd want them to accept you with.
Sure, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
we all, like you said, we're all humans and we all have emotions, and sometimes we have good days and sometimes we have bad days. So it's just a matter of just respect the other person's space, and then don't worry about if things don't go your way.
Exactly. Well, I'm not to bring religion into it, but I'm a firm believer God has a plan for all of us. And sometimes you're going down the road and you're thinking to yourself, God wants you to take a right, but He wants you to take a left instead. So you just have faith in the plan that things will work out.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree with you.
And again, I do want to say that I was kidding before about the whole restraining thing. Actually, I'll be honest with you. The comic book creators I've dealt with and talked to, I would say 99.999% of them have been just fantastic people overall, just really super
Yes,
folks.
I
So
think for the most part, you know, artists are they, I'll be honest with you, most artists are very, have a big ego,
mhm.
and the thing is that because they have a talent that a lot of people don't simply have. And the thing is that they feel like uh, artists, I think for the most part, want to create, they want to, and they want their creation to be accepted. You
Right.
know, if you're a pure artist, you do art for art's sake. You don't care about the ramifications of what people think because you're doing it because you want to do it and you believe in it. Now, comic book artists are in that strange nebulous zone of where we're doing commerce. We're doing creations that we hope will resonate with people so that they'll actually support it and buy it, and we can make a living off of it. And that's the tricky part. You can spend all day drawing a comic book, or doing art. The tricky part is to get someone to pay for it.
Hmm.
That's the big thing. And we I mean, I believe that for the most part a lot of artists are in competition with each other, because they're trying to, they think that there's a number of people who will support, comic books. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I believe that, you know, with what, 5 billion people on the earth,
Hmm.
correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like billions and billions of people, or you can't tell me every single one of them has never read your comic. And the thing is that I look at them as potential readers. Don't look at it as by I never look at it as a finite number of people. I look at it as, put a large number of potential readers you haven't reached yet.
Hmm.
And if you do stuff that's good, eventually people are going to find out about it.
Well, when it comes to comics and art, I always go back to the old saying about there's a reason why Baskin Robbins has 31 flavors. It's because people have different taste. And I do agree with you that there are some artists that seem to think, well, if so and so wasn't working, I'd have their fans, or if so and so wasn't putting their book out, they'd be reading my book. And that's not, again, that's not the case. It really does boil down to, are you putting out a good product? And the thing is, I've never seen a comic book fan go, well, I can only buy one book this month, or I can only buy two books this month. It's like if it's good and they like it, they're going to buy multiple books. They're going to buy your book. They're going to buy someone else's book, and the variety is what really sells it. I have never looked at a book and said, "Well, I'm going to buy this book because it looks exactly like this comic book, or this artist draws exactly like this artist." I look at it like this guy's got this style. This guy, you can definitely tell there's like an Alex Raymond flair to it. This guy looks like he had a Milton Caniff flair. You can see where the inspirations are coming from, but it's the whole idea that there's the variety there. And again,
Yeah.
not to get too philosophical, but my whole thing has always been that when it comes to competition, the only person you're competing against is the person you were yesterday. Are you a better artist or writer today than you were yesterday? That's the only person you really need to be competing with.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that's true. My thing is that what are we really? But I mean, what's really the point of comics, to be honest? We don't need it to survive.
Right.
We don't need it to further our existence. The comics are meant for one thing and one thing only, is to entertain. That's,
Exactly.
that's the only purpose of its existence. People don't like to be bored, and comics provide things that will entertain them in some fashion. And that's our only goal, is to entertain. When you lose sight of that, then you lose sight of what your whole purpose of doing comics to begin with. It's not about who you're competing against. It's about who you want to entertain.
Right.
I don't care. It always bothers me when I see other creators or comic book publish brag about how much money they've made, or try to pick a fight with another creator. I don't see any purpose in that, and I don't see how that is helpful, to make a healthy industry. Our goal. Look at how manga is kicking American comics, to the curb.
Yeah.
It used to be, when I started doing manga back in the late '70s, early '80s, you know, manga was nothing. Nobody knew. You asked 100 fans of who read comics. You asked them if they read manga. 99 of them would probably say they've never even heard of manga. Now manga is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's infiltrated, our culture, our pop culture. And they didn't do that, just willy nilly. They did that because they provided an escape mechanism, and they provided a good quality product that entertained people.
Mhm.
When you're producing comics that no longer entertain people, then you are on the road to ruination. And you lose sight of that. Eventually, I don't care how big you are, you're going to go out of business. It's just a simple fact. I mean, our Antarctic Press has been around for 41 years now, and I have seen literally hundreds of comic book publishers come and go. Comic book publishers with way more money, way more influence, way more reach, way more retailer support, and yet we're still here.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? How can you explain a small company like ours, still producing comics 41 years later, and hopefully another 41 years in the future? Who knows if I ever live that long, you know? But it just goes to show you that our main philosophy is our readers and our customers. That should always be the number one thing for any comic book publisher or creator. Okay, because if you're just wanting to draw comics for yourself, fine, do it. Just do it for yourself. But if you want to hope to make money out of it, you've got to provide a product people want.
Right. Well, I do want to touch on what you said about writing comics for yourself. I do think that is part of what makes a successful book is, are you writing a story that you yourself would want to read? Are you entertaining yourself? There are some creators that I have heard of, especially working with DC and Marvel sometimes. I get this feeling it's a case of, well, it's I'm running Batman or I'm running Superman, but I have no desire to write Batman or Superman. It's just I have a desire to be on a high profile character that is going to get me noticed or is going to be a stepping stone in my career. And it's a difference between I'm making comic books because it's my art, it's my passion, as opposed to I'm making comic books because it's my paycheck, it's my
Well,
job.
that's something you have to ask yourself. I mean, before independent comic books came out, before the direct market became a thing, there was only two games in town, Marvel and DC.
Yeah,
And the thing was is that as long as they had a stranglehold on the industry, they could dictate the terms. And the thing about it is that yes, working for Marvel and DC gave you a steady paycheck, but it you lost ownership of everything you created.
right,
You own anything. And I understand I understand that. I don't think it's a right, but I understand why they did it. Because if they uh, let creators own their creations, then Marvel and DC have no lifeline, to any IPs, and that's their whole shtick is that they have to own their IPs in order to continue maintaining their cash flow. Because can you imagine if Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, if Steve Ditko and Stan Lee completely owned Spider-Man, you know,
right.
uh, they would be billionaires today.
Oh, yeah.
That's just the thing. But that's the trade-off. Do you want a regular paycheck and exposure, and or do you want to take a chance on your own creation and see if people will gravitate toward it? Sometimes a lot of creators use Marvel and DC as a stepping stone to bigger things. That's not the case anymore, because now Marvel and DC, Marvel especially, learned a valuable lesson during the 90s when the image guys left. Okay, they learned that they can no longer make the artist the superstar, because if they did, then they're just going to leave. So they Marvel learned a valuable lesson in keeping, basically their creators, on the plantation, basically. They want to make sure that they no longer are in that, because in the last, let's say last 10, 15 years, what creators have worked for Marvel and DC and have just exploded like the image guys did? I
Very
can't
few.
I can't name anybody. Okay.
Um, there are a couple of talents I know of that are really good, but they're
Yeah,
not they're
but
not
they're
they're,
not
they're not like John Byrne in the '80s or Frank Miller.
right. If you notice, the artists were no after the whole image thing, artists were no longer to be emphasized.
Mhm.
Okay, it was the writers now. Okay, writers now are more have more power than artists did. It used to be the artists held all the power. Okay, and until the image thing started, the switch was made to the writers, because let's be honest, the image stuff was very poorly written, not good writing.
Yeah,
Okay, art fantastic. Okay, but eventually art can only carry you so far. You have to
right.
have good characters, you got to have good stories, and that's where the writers come in. And then that's the age of the writer. But now that's starting to wane too, because writers are producing stuff that people no longer enjoy or care about, and that's the big mistake that they're making. I don't know if that's the writers trying to force an agenda, or is that's an edict from on high that they have to write this kind of material. But the reason why comics, especially American comics, are not selling is because the writing is so poor. You know, the only comics people talk about are the ones that are really well written. And uh, because, and even that is hard to. The thing is the writing, at least nowadays, is not very. It's not what you call it. There's not a lot of variety. It's all very violent. It's all very negative. It's very dystopian. What happened to uplifting, positive comic books where people will say, yeah, I mean that is a real superhero that I can identify with. There's nothing positive about American comics these days.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single one where I mean, I'll be honest with you, I haven't read a modern superhero comic in literally 10, 15 years.
Right.
Because it's just none of it seems to attract me in any form. I always gravitate to the old material because at least they were entertaining. you know
Yeah, that tends to be me. I usually stick to back issues, and most of the new stuff I'm buying are like the facsimile editions, the reprint books.
Yeah, because they had to win you over. Okay. The thing is, when Marvel and DC were bought by big corporations, they didn't have to care anymore
Yeah.
because they now have a lifeline from big corporations. They don't have to convince you to buy the comic anymore. Okay, they don't have to do anything to win you over. Back then, it was huge competition between Marvel and DC. Huge. They had to win you over with good stories, good characters, and they had to try really hard. They only got the best that they could get to make sure that they could, grab your eye on the newsstand and make you plunk your 25 cents down to buy it.
Yeah.
The thing about it now is that they don't care. It's all about the covers. Okay. I personally, and I've suggested this in the past. Why does a Marvel DC just do nothing but covers? Have blank
Just
interior and
just 10 books.
just slab them.
Yeah.
They Marvel DC could afford to slab them. To slab every single one of them. You know, and they don't even have to go through CGC. They can just create their own slabbing, grading company right there. Marvel and DC grading company. They could do that very easily. Slab all their books with great covers.
Mhm.
Every single one of them 9.8s. Just put them on the shelf. And just have just a kick-ass cover,
Yeah.
and just have a blank interior. Just so that people have the illusion that they have a comic book because they're never going to crack it open and actually read it. I mean, what's the point of that? Because that would ruin the resale value of the book. You know.
Well, the sad thing about it is that it's not that far away from it because there are guys I know that have been lifelong collectors, and I hear them talk about, well, I picked up the new Batman book, but I haven't read it. I bought it because I've got a complete run of Batman from such and such to now, and I don't want to break the run. And same thing with Spider-Man collectors. There are people that are buying these books and they are not actually reading them; they're just collecting them, and it's kind of sad. And going back to what you said about manga, I'll be honest with you, I was kind of burned out with American comic books for a while. I mean, I love writing my own books. I like writing my own stuff, and there's the older stuff I enjoy. But really, when I discovered manga, that reignited my passion for what the medium could be. All of a sudden, I was like, oh my God, there's just so much material here that breaks the mold of what DC and Marvel is doing. Um, I mean, I've told people before I'm a huge fan of My Hero Academia, and I always tell people if you're burned out on what DC and Marvel's doing, dark and grim, this is the book you need to be reading. It's like this is the comic book that you read this, and this is like it's got the old school Marvel vibe to it.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you saw the finale, but the finale, I've told people before, people were going on about Gunn's Superman was the best thing that came out last year. Marvel's Fantastic Four First Steps was the best thing that came out last year. I said, no. Season 8 of My Hero Academia, that was the best superhero story last year. That was the best in the medium, I think.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show you, why do you think manga has taken over sales? Because they're providing readers with something that they want. You know,
Exactly.
and the thing about the biggest difference between American comics industry and the Japanese comic industry is that I mean, there's a lot of stuff you probably don't know about the Japanese comic book industry, the manga industry, is that thousands of creators are trying to get into the manga industry, and believe me, the stuff that you're getting here is the best.
Yeah.
Okay, there are thousands of manga stories that are being created in Japan that simply are forgotten,
Right.
because but they have because the competition is so fierce in Japan. But the trade-off is that anything you create, you own. Okay, so and if you notice in Japan, many of the manga stories come to an end.
Right.
Some there are some exceptions like Dragon Ball, but eventually that's probably going to come to an end. And One Piece has been around for what, thousands of editions, or
Yeah.
thousands of chapters. It'll eventually come to an end. Okay, because all manga, every single manga story in the existence of the creation of manga has a beginning, a middle, and an eventual end.
Right.
Okay, the problem with American comics is that no one knows where to begin. Okay,
Exactly.
and they don't know where it is now. Okay, is the same character I'm reading now the same character from the very first issue? Chances are no. Because since the original creators no longer have any control over it, they the corporations who own the big two only are interested in keeping the IP going so they
Right.
can maintain their trademarks, maintain their copyrights, and see if they can parlay that into something, into monetary gain. I don't fault them for that. Okay. If they have something that they can make money off of it, then great. But eventually you lose the soul of the whole they'll lose the soul and the purpose of the character. And
Exactly.
that's the that's where I think we're falling short of. And that's where I think independent comics are coming in of their own. They're proving that you don't have to go to Marvel and DC to be entertained. Mangas prove that. Independent comics have proved that. There's simply uh, a huge, and I think the market potential is huge. People are saying, well, people don't read as much anymore. You see, I disagree with that. I think they're reading it, they're just reading in a different platform. They're reading it on digital, you know. They don't read comics because they're too expensive, and it's no longer the disposable entertainment that it was originally created to be. People forget comics were not meant to be collected. They were meant to be read, cheap. They were cheaply printed, cheaply produced, cheaply sold, to be read once and then thrown away.
Right.
Okay, you're going to get the next one next month. Okay, now they become collectibles, and that's where the big mistake is. Okay, when they become collectibles, then everyone buys it because they're going to see if they're going to increase in value sometime later on down the line. You know, Overall, it's still a fairly cheap buy-in, and if the book takes off, then you may be able to resell it at a large return. But you see, that's not the point of comics. Comics are for you to sit down, read, enjoy, maybe get something out of it, and then maybe look forward to getting the next issue. That's our job. Our job is to maintain that entertainment factor for our readers and for our fans, to somehow ignite their imagination, to the point where they'll want to come back to continue reading, the adventures of the characters you've created.
Yeah. Ben, I was going to say, I'm getting a message. We're down about 4 minutes on recording time. I was
Okay.
going to say, before we go, I did want to ask if there's anything that you would like to announce, anything you'd like to, any projects you want to plug, any Kickstarters. If you would, please feel free.
Well, I'm a very bad salesman, but I do have a Kickstarter campaign going called Fur Force, Volume One. It's a throwback to furry and funny animal comics. There's superheroes like in the tradition of Captain Carrot, and Atomic Mouse and everything. But it's just sort of like bringing funny animal superheroes back into the forefront again, and seeing how well that does. And of course, I have Crimson Nun #2, which came out, which just ended recently. So we're Ron Fortier is the writer of that. He did uh, uh, Green Hornet comics back in the day, and of course, I'm doing Ninja High School and Kendra #3. I'm working on that, and so I'm just basically keeping as busy as possible.
Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. I want to thank Ben Dunn for joining us today. Also, I want to encourage everybody out there, if you get a chance to, check out Ben's website. It's benduncomics.com. There you can find out about projects that Ben is working on at this time. Uh, Kickstarters he has in the works, as well as projects that are coming out from Antarctic Press. Plus, two, Antarctic Press, again, is one of the few companies that's still taking open submissions. So if you're a writer or an artist and you'd like an opportunity to get published, Antarctic Press is one of your best bets. Anyway, we want to thank Ben again for joining us, and this is Dollar Bin Bandit Dan signing off saying, keep reading those comic books, guys. Thanks. Bye. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're enjoying this edition of Dollar Bin Bandits. My name is Dan Johnson. I'm going to be your bandit for the day. And joining me is my very special guest, Ben Dunn. For folks who do not know, Ben Dunn is one of the co-founders of Antarctic Press. And for the last 40 years, Antarctic Press has been one of the leading voices in independent comic books. Today, Ben is going to be joining me, and we're going to talk about his career, but we're also going to be talking about the state of indie comics and the impact that it has on the market today. It's a very lively discussion. It was such a lively one, we had to do it in two parts. But like I said, stick with us. I think you're going to have a great time. Thank you, folks.